Acts chapter 27, part 2. I have part 1 written here. I should have changed that. The storm at sea. So before we move on, let's go ahead and look at our key verse for the book of Acts. And let's read that together. Acts 1:8. But ye shall receive power after that the Holy Ghost is come upon you, and ye shall be witnesses unto me, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and in Samaria and unto the uttermost part of the earth. So what's left? We only have 4 lessons left in our study of the book of Acts. And as you can see from the chart, we are here. We're at the storm at sea, verses 13 through 26 of chapter 27. So we're going to do a quick review here. This trip so far, shortly after Paul was arrested in Jerusalem, and he was in the castle waiting to speak to the crowd, the Lord Jesus appeared to him and told him to not be afraid, because God's plan for him was to preach the gospel in Rome. So that was way back a couple of years before today's events. And he had that in the back of his mind, I'm sure, as he's heading out that way. So 2 years later, Paul was finally on board the ship to Rome. And last week we saw the preliminary preparation as Paul was assigned a Roman centurion named Julius with his troops to accompany him on his trip to Rome. And next week we'll see that there were 276 people on that ship by the time they get there. Well, they don't get there. By the time they get shipwrecked. 276 souls on board. And so we have a centurion with probably anywhere between 80 and 100 troops. And then that's a lot of other people. We know that Paul's not the only prisoner. We don't know how many. Luke doesn't tell us how many prisoners. But it's probably a good group because it doesn't take that many people to sail the ship. And they had some sailors there, obviously. So probably a lot of prisoners and a lot of soldiers. Then it showed, we looked at the courteous treatment inside, and it was kind of surprising, but at their first stop, Julius gave Paul liberty to go out to his friends in town, and it says freshen himself up. We talked about what that might mean, maybe get a shower, maybe change of clothes, or at least wash his garments. He'd been in prison for 2 years, so probably needed some freshening up. Maybe it was because the centurion had to stand next to him, a lot. They wanted him to smell sweet. Anyway, then we saw that they had contrary winds. From the very first stage of the trip, the wind had been blowing in the wrong direction. Well, it had been blowing in the right direction, which was the wrong direction for traveling westbound in the Mediterranean at that time of year. And then in Crete and Fair Havens, the crew was trying to hug the shore of the northern coast as they made their way west toward Italy, but just about the time they hit the Aegean Sea, which extends north, the winds blew them south down toward the island of Crete, and they made their way to a small harbor called Fair Havens, and that's on the south side of the island, and they probably should have stayed there. In fact, the next point was Paul gave them a dire warning. He said, we need to stay here because if we go on, we will lose we're in danger of losing the ship, the cargo, and our lives. So he warned them, but the centurion had the ultimate say in the matter. He had more control over the ship than the owner of the ship because he was representing the emperor. And all the sailors wanted to continue on. They wanted to find a port that was a little nicer to winter in. It was really late in the season for sailing, past the time when they should have been out there. And so they wanted to find a better harbor, and they convinced Julius and centurion. He said, let's go for it. We're going to make it. It's not that far. We just got to go southwest a little bit, bend around, head northwest. And they felt like they could make it. And Paul, as we talked about, had already been shipwrecked several times by this stage in his life. And he probably said to himself, well, here we go again. He knew they shouldn't be out on the water. So please turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 27, beginning in 13. And in verse 13, we have a deceitful breeze. It says, and when the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. Now, Luke, in his narration here, has been saying, we did this, we're on board. And now he's saying, because it's their decision, I think is why he switched it from we to they. The sailors did this. They figured, oh, we're okay. We're gonna take off. The wind is great. You got a friendly little breeze blowing there. And they were attempting. It says they sailed close by Crete, and so they were attempting to keep the ship as close to shore as possible without hitting any rocks and stuff. So that's are hugging the coastline, thinking if the wind became a problem, they could just drop anchor and make it to shore. I think that's what they had in mind. But the coastline jogged northward, and when they tried to turn the corner, a funny thing happened. Verse 14, the wind changed. It says, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And the word tempestuous here means like a typhoon. It was whirling and swirling around, and there was no way to properly adjust the sails to take advantage of the wind. They just couldn't do it. And the wind was named Euroclydon. That's an interesting name. It's the only place in the Bible where that word is used. So, of course, Bible scholars don't agree on what it means. It may have meant that the wind was blowing from predominantly east-northeast, or it may have referred to the fact that it came from all different directions. But I have my own theory on what Euroclydon means. You ready for this? It means, what in the world are you doing out in a ship on the Mediterranean at this time of year in this weather? Roughly translated. Or it could be translated, is your life insurance paid up? So in verse 15, we find them stuck in a bad situation. It says, and when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. Again, for some reason, Luke includes himself in that when he says we, but that the ship was caught, that phrase, they wanted to steer the ship to the northwest, but they couldn't steer it. Half the time the rudder was probably out of the water with the waves, lifting the bow and crashing it down. So they really couldn't steer it. He said, the ship was caught. We could not bear up into the wind. And the Greek phrase used there is literally into the eye of the wind, which means to face the wind. They didn't want to get the ship partly turned because that would be worse, because then the ship would be rolling from side to side in the waves. It's much better for the ship to hit the waves in the front and then rock down into what's the bottom called? Trough. Hull. Yeah. So I'm thinking, so you don't want to go sideways in a weather like that. That'd be really bad. So it says they gave up and they just let it go where it would. It says we let her drive. And verse 16, they, on these boats, they would have a little shore boat, is what I called it, in order to get from the ship to the shore. And it wasn't big enough to fit everybody, so it was a much smaller boat, but they were dragging it behind the boat, basically. And they were concerned, I think, that it would crash into the main boat with the wind blowing it every which way. So it says in verse 16, and running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. So the island of Clauda, also called, same thing without the L, Cauda, is the modern island called, it's got several names, Gaudhos or Gotso. My Greek's a little rusty, sorry. Anyway, this little island was about 30 miles due south of the port of Phoenix, which is where they were trying to go. Going under the island means they're in between the Crete, the main island, and this little island, so they're in between it. But they wanted to head due north to Phoenix, and instead they're due south by this little island. So when they got in the lee of the island, they got a slight break from the wind and the waves. So the island is apparently breaking up some of the waves for them. It says we had much work to come by the boat. They look at each other and say, wow, that was really something. You know, all those waves all of a sudden. Maybe we should rescue the little boat and get it back into the ship. So all this time, the shore boat was being dragged behind the ship, and it needed to be brought on board so it wouldn't crash into them during the storm. And the small boat, it says, they had a hard time getting it out of the water. Do you have any idea why that might be? It's probably full of water. So they have to get it dumped out, and Luke wrote, we worked hard getting it back into the ship. So probably had everybody tugging on the ropes to get that little boat back up on the ship. In verse 17, they tried to make the ship sturdier. It says, and when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. So that first part, using helps and undergirding the ship, they got the smaller boat back into the ship. Then they wrapped the ship with large ropes to try to keep it from falling apart. And see, this is a good illustration here of what they were doing. Just try to strengthen the boards. And they didn't want the ship falling apart. So they used that. And it would be difficult to do in calm water. You know, getting a rope under the ship and then tying it off fast. And they're doing it in rough waters. The process is called frapping. That's something new I learned. Where they take usually from 4 to 6 long cables or ropes and wrap them horizontally around the ship from stem to stern. And it says, fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands. You know where the quicksands are in the Mediterranean? Way down off the coast of Africa. They were afraid they were going to be blown all the way down to Africa. And on that shore, a lot of ships were lost because they would get stuck in the quicksands, and there was no way to get to shore from there. It killed a lot of people, and that's what they were afraid of when it says here, fearing lest they should fall into quicksands. And so, because they wanted to avoid that, it says they strake the sail, and so were driven. The winds were blowing their sails and driving them southeast toward the quicksand of Africa. And so the phrase strike the sail means getting rid of the sail. If, you know, they would raise the sail up, so that meant that they dropped the sails down to nothing. And it meant to let the sea control where the boat was heading. It was a move of desperation. You really didn't want the sea to control where you're going, but you also didn't want the wind blowing you up onto the quicksands. In verse 18, they decided to lighten the load. And I title this verse, There Goes the Cargo. It says, and we, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. And interesting that Luke says we were tossed about, and they lightened the ship. Everybody on board was tossed around. The ship would rise up with the waves and then drop down in the swells, and the passengers, the prisoners, were probably hanging on for dear life. We don't know if any of the prisoners were sailors, but most likely not. Most likely they were not used to being in a boat on the Mediterranean in a big storm. So there's a great passage in Psalms, I put the reference up there, talks about this type of adventure. Psalm 107, 23 through 28 says, "They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, and then they go down again to the depths. Their soul is melted because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man, and are at their wits' end. Then they cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distresses." I love that. I love that passage. It's a passage of faith. These guys, they're out doing the business of the Lord. They have highs, they have lows, and things get really tough, and then they cry unto the Lord, and he delivers them. But going back to our text, at this point the ship was leaking, and as it took on more and more water, it sat lower and lower in the sea, which meant that waves had an easier time getting into it. So the sailors knew they needed to get some more buoyancy, so they began tossing the cargo overboard. And if you think about it, Paul did mention, that they were in danger of losing their cargo, didn't he? Back when he warned them to stay in Fair Havens. That wasn't that long ago. And in verse 19, they lightened the ship a little bit more. Said, "On the third day, we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship." Now, this is the third day since they departed from Fair Havens. So the ship was still slowly going down, and so they began just throwing stuff overboard. Anything that had weight, they needed to lighten the ship. And Luke stated that we cast out the tackling with our own hands. Everybody on board the ship, let me rephrase that. Nobody on the ship wanted it to go down. So everybody joined in lightening the load. And the word tackling could also be translated furniture. So it wasn't just, in the picture it shows a nice tackle there, but they were throwing everything, silverware, the captain's chair, the fishing poles, everything that they could throw off the ship, they were throwing off the ship. You see later that they did save some food, but they did that because they didn't know how long they'd be bouncing around in the ocean in the storm. In verse 20, a cloud of depression overshadowed everybody on board the ship. See a little cloud of depression up there. Yeah. It says, "We, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the." I read that verse. That's 18. Let's go to 20. "And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away." So Luke stated that neither sun nor stars in many days appear. I think I've been to a place like that. Seattle. Always cloudy. Anyway, they didn't have a GPS to tell them where they were. Sailors, of course, would use the sky to tell them where they were. When they're out in the middle of the ocean, you see no land anywhere. They'd be looking up to navigate by the stars. Well, there's no stars. How about the sun? Well, there's no sun. So they were completely lost. And it says, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away, since they had no idea where they were or even what direction they were heading. You couldn't tell if they were heading north, south, east, west. They assumed they're heading south, because that's the direction the wind was blowing, but they just didn't know. They lost all hope of making it out of there alive. And now it was just a matter of time before they all died, basically, is what is going on in their heads. So it was a pretty desperate, gloomy time. And at a time like this, you could begin thinking about your life and maybe wondering if there was more to life than just being a sailor or a soldier or merchantman. You might begin to think maybe you should make yourself right with God. This is kind of a good opportunity for Paul to preach. I mean, if the ship would just stop rocking for a minute. So Paul didn't have that problem. Why did Paul not have that problem? Well, God had told him he was going to be preaching in Rome. So he knew he was not going to die that day on board that ship. Regardless of whatever circumstances, Paul had faith that God would fulfill his promise and deliver him to Rome. So even though that promise was over 2 years ago, he still believed it would happen. And I believe it's important to note that Paul was not just concerned about himself, but I believe we'll see that Paul was praying for the souls of everyone in that boat. He was likely praying, Lord, don't let these men die until I've had a chance to share the good news with them. And I believe we see that in a later verse. But then first we get 21. Paul finally spoke up, and he got his "I told you so" in. We mentioned that last week. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and have gained this harm and loss. So this is a well-deserved "I told you so." He reminded them of his warning back in Fair Havens that if they set sail from Crete, they would possibly lose the cargo and the ship and their lives. But now he had good news for them. In verse 22, Paul provided a new hope. He said, And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. Paul explained that none of them would die on this trip. And that was good news to these men. As I said, they were despaired. They had a cloud of despair over their heads. They'd given up all hope. But we serve the God of infinite hope. When you have nowhere to turn and all is lost, Jesus is where to turn. And he will never leave us or forsake us. And Paul knew that. Paul had received the promise of God, and he was providing some hope to these men who had given up all hope. And then in verse 23, Paul explained how he knew this. I know you're wondering why I have a picture of Jonah and the whale up there. I'll get to that. It said, For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve. What we see from this verse is that while the sailors were crying out in despair, Paul had been praying for everyone who was on the ship with him. With this visit from the angel of God, God assured Paul that his prayers had been answered. And so I find it interesting to compare this time in Paul's journey with Jonah, who was in a similar situation. Both of them were God's servants. Jonah was a prophet, and Paul was the missionary. Both were in a ship in a storm surrounded by pagan sailors. The main difference was in attitude. Jonah was sailing in defiance of God's command, God's will, while Paul was sailing in full obedience towards God's will. Paul was able to say, God, whose I am and whom I serve. And Jonah said, I don't have the reference down there, but he said, I am in Hebrew, and I fear the God of heaven, which hath made the sea and land. But he didn't say whose I am and whom I serve, because he was running from God at the time. Interestingly, the sailors surrounding Jonah were saved by throwing him into the sea, while the sailors surrounding Paul were saved by keeping everybody in the ship until it was time for everyone to leave. And we'll see that when we get to verse 30. Both Paul and Jonah had a similar experience once they got to their appointed destination. Jonah preached, and God delivered. Paul preached, and God delivered. You might even say Jonah had a bigger result because the whole city of Nineveh got repented. Um, anyway, but Paul had a very effective jail ministry, or ministry from jail, in the city of Rome when he finally got there. And now in verse 24, Paul delivered the good news that he received from the angel. Said the angel told him, I'm sure the angel looked exactly like that too, saying, "Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee." So that fear not, Paul, that's a typical assurance from angels when they appear in the Bible. Most likely, anyone have a guess why angels would say that? Most of the time, an angel appears in the Bible, and the first thing they say is, "Fear not." I believe that's probably because if we were to see an angel, we'd be afraid. And so they calm the person's fears right away. Um, the angel told him he did not need to fear the angel, and he did not need to fear his current set of circumstances. It says, the angel reminded Paul that about what Jesus had told him in the prison cell 2 years ago in Jerusalem. He said, "Thou must be brought before Caesar." Paul could not die at sea if God had made an appointment for him to appear before Caesar in Rome. And then the angel said, "God hath given thee all them that sail with thee." What a great assurance for Paul. While everyone else had been worried about the storm, Paul had been worried about their souls. There's no doubt in my mind that the souls of the soldiers and sailors had been on Paul's heart since they boarded the ship back in Caesarea. Now the angel affirmed Paul's prayers and told him that no one from this ship will be lost at sea. What a great encouraging word from the angel to Paul. Verse 25, Paul says, "Be of good cheer." He says, "Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me." So once again, Paul is encouraging his travel companions to be of good cheer. This is the second time he said this in this presentation, right? He started out, "Be of good cheer." Now he says again, "Be of good cheer." To repeat from verse 22 what he stated, "Now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you but the ship." Now he's told about the angel. He tells him again, "Be of good cheer." So he says, For I believe God." Here Paul is proclaiming his faith in God. He knew that God controlled the winds and the sea. And he knew that God had promised to deliver him safely to Rome. And finally, in verse 26, Paul stated there is one provision for this promise of deliverance. He said, "Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island." This last phrase, I believe, was predicting what was going to happen, so that when it did happen, all the men in the ship would know that Paul was speaking the truth. He said, "We're all going to be saved, but we have to cast upon a certain island." Well, see, how would Paul know which island? You ever wonder about that? The angel said, "You must be cast upon a certain island." Paul didn't say, "Which island?" He just believed that it didn't matter which island because Paul was trusting God to get them to the correct island. The sailors had given up any hope of being delivered from death, so they were really looking for any island. Any island would be better than the bottom of the sea. So Paul was confident that any island they landed on would be the island that God intended. Do you have any questions? Anything you want to mention regarding this? Pastor, would you like to close us in prayer then?